If you've come here looking for answers to the Eternal format, I have excellent news for you. I do not have them, but neither does anybody else. Welcome to Tournament Tactician, what was once a tournament tier list, now something a little different. Tournament tier lists stopped being the most useful way to convey information to you a little while ago. I did more of a meta overview type thing, and that is also not the most articulate way to prescribe this meta to you. And normally, I'd love to default and say, hey, play the good decks, but I'm going to get into in a minute here why that is not really an applicable piece of advice for this Eternal Open. Let's start with the decks that we know are performing well. Over the last 5 days, from about Saturday to today, which is Wednesday, we've had a number of daily tournaments, rather small, usually less than 30 players, and these are the winning lineups from said events. You can pause and look over these if you want. Not going to talk about it too much, because as you can see, they're all over the place, and they completely lack things like Twisted Fate Temple and Endure. The reason that I say there are no good decks is because this meta feels very snowbally. Like one missed turn in the early game and things can really start to get out of hand for you. This definitely feels like a meta where games are not ending in the early game as often. They tend to end more in the mid game. For those of you a little confused, I would say early game is like turns, maybe we say it like 1 to 3, like 4 to 7, and then like 8 plus. Is that fair? Maybe we even consider the late game like 7+, because that's when like War Mother's Call is actually dropping a War Mother's Call on you. Is this like an understandable? And you might even be able to consider this like 1 to 4, soft 1 to 4. So for the most part, it feels like things are really based around what gets set up in the early game, and then that'll transition into a mid game finish, or we take it to the late game. With very few decks are actually going to the late game. It's like Seraphine, it's like War Mothers, and the things that are doing well in the late game kind of just have a stranglehold on the late game. Like War Mother's Call, it's impossible for a lot of these decks to actually finish off the opponent once a War Mother's Call has resolved. And I think that's a big reason that you're not really seeing Endure do too much in tournaments, is like War Mother's is probably just the better Shadow Isle Freljord deck. Is it more consistent? Again, we're going back to, with everything having such an explosive early game, a lot of the decks that have the most explosive early games, we're talking like even Endure, Nasus, Tristana, Azir Aurelia, Annie Jin, Poppy Ziggs, they can get shut down by an Avalanche. Unfortunately, if you don't have an Avalanche, then you have like one of the worst early games in War Mother's Call. But that's kind of how I've been reading the meta, is like questions and answers get asked and answered in turns 1 through 3, into turn 4. And that really determines the pace of the game, and there's not a lot of like comeback mechanics outside of like attroing your opponent, right? When we look at something like Azir Aurelia, which is apparently a meta definer, so let's first talk stats and why we don't have them here, because usually I like to look at those. So if we go to Runeterra AR and we look at the last 2 days, we look at Azir Aurelia, there were 1,600 matches in the last 2 days with a 47% win rate. Then if we go to Mastering Runeterra, why is that? Okay, so if we go to Mastering Runeterra, last 3 days, I guarantee you in that 1 day, because this is 3 day and this is 2 day, there were not 5,000 additional matches of Azir Aurelia played for an additional 4% win rate. So like stats are just really skewed. The stat site that I like to use, which is I guess all my thing, yeah, it's showing whatever, is LLORstats.com. And it does not have eternal stats, or if it does, I don't know how to access them. So unfortunately, stats are just kind of out the window this time around, which, again, they weren't super useful to begin with, because a lot of these decks have like multiple champion splits, like things like Endora split between Mono Elise and Elise Callista, War Mothers split, but War Mothers I think is always Trundle Volibear, but who knows. Anyway, this is how you kind of need to be thinking of your lineup and assessing it. None of these decks are as consistent as you would want them to be. And that's kind of why it feels like we don't have a good deck. Usually the good deck does the broken thing and does the broken thing pretty consistently. For example, like Endure has one of the most explosive early games you can imagine in Legends of Runeterra with a perfect hand, but in a non-perfect hand, yeah, things get a little bit dicey. So things that are very snowbally and very explosive, and that is why they're doing well, include Azir Aurelia, Nasus, and Endure, I would say. TF Temple's not like crazy explosive. TF Temple is more like, if you don't answer Temple, then I probably just run away with the game. I would say that's about it. Titanic actually shouldn't be on here. That's War Mothers. Yeah, I would say like what do we call it? Like the Butcher decks in Azir Aurelia have the most explosive early game potential. And then something like Victor Aphelios is consistently doing well because it's very good at shutting down that explosiveness or like a mid-level explosion. And then Bandle City Seraphine has the tools to shut it down, but isn't as consistent with it because it's not running as many like 1 and 2Fs. And that's kind of like why one of the reasons that like TF Temple is still doing well as well as like it has some good tools for shutting down the early game or at least like contesting the board. The problem with TF Temple is that it has no answer to Atrocity. Unless you're running Aloof Travelers, which is something that I really liked in TF Temple because, again, in region, you have no answer for Atrocity. You have no answer for big units. So I liked Aloof Travelers because it helps with these. Doesn't help with this because they have too many big units. So there's so many different cornerstones of the meta that are making it difficult to evaluate, where you have like the aggro decks doing very well and just kind of ending things in like the early and the mid game. And like as long as you can play around a single Avalanche or War Mothers, you're going to run over a lot of decks. TF Temple will get you sometimes. Victor Aphelios will get you a lot of the time. And that's why if I had to pick a deck, a singular deck to like recommend to people, it would probably be Victor Aphelios because you have the tools to contest these early decks and these explosive decks. You have the threat density to sort of like chew through something like Swain Nora, as well as like the removal options, like Swain Nora and Plunder. And then you don't get a late game edge on War Mothers, but you can pull out a big elusive to sneak under them, as well as maybe snowball some damage from your Victor and your Aphelios. Like Victor Aphelios has the tools to fight every other deck at pretty much every stage of the game. It's not going to be clean, it's not going to be consistent, but it has the tools to deal with everything. And overall, the deck is rather consistent because it is not reliant on Victor or Aphelios in a generic sense. And so if we had to pick one deck that I would recommend everyone, it would be Victor Aphelios. And there's a lot of different versions of this running around. There are people that are on like 3 Back Alley Bar. There are people that are on like Epiphany and Sumpworks. Or some temple, I don't remember what it's, the Shroom Landmark, and a couple of other different variations. So I really like Victor Aphelios. I think that should be like, I don't know if I'd call it the number 1 deck, but that's kind of where we're at. So let's try and go through this deck by deck, right? So Seraphine is like kind of mid in the early game. We're going to try and blow through this as fast as possible. I don't want to be filling out this entire chart with you. Like pretty mid in the early game. Like it has the tools to deal with other decks. It's just a matter of like you don't run a lot of copies of them. So that's why it's not like great. In the mid game is where like you're like pretty good, like mid to good. You don't have any healing. So like if these decks can kind of rush you down, you're kind of fucked at that point. You really have to have just drawn things good in the early game. And then like late game, I would say is very good for this deck because it doesn't matter what your board looks like, Seraphine can still kill you. TF Temple, pretty good in the early game, you know, doing pretty well against these aggro decks. Again, like doesn't really have what do you call it? It doesn't have healing. So that's going to be a little bit of an issue if you get like aggro down early, but you have enough low drops to hopefully supplement that. Has the explosive power of like just, you know, curving into a temple and go into the races. Has a horrendous late game. It really spikes in the mid game. Everything that it's doing in the late game is just like 1 unit plus what it was doing in the mid game. So that's not great. War Mothers, atrocious early game. It's all like you're just relying completely on Vile Feast and Avalanche. And again, those are good tools for dealing with these, but it's really not up to you whether or not you drew an Avalanche in the early game. And that is like literally your only option. But like you're just trying to spend it ramping. Mid game, excuse me. The only thing that you're getting in the mid game that you didn't have in the early game is Trundle. So granted, Trundle is pretty good at like stonewalling certain things. So like, you know, probably not the best mid game in the world. I'd even go to call it bad. Like you don't necessarily get to stop things from killing you in the mid game, even with the healing that you have. And then you have like the best late game imaginable. And you're also pretty good at getting to the late game. But again, by like turn 6, you're still not dropping a War Mother's Call unless you open like really, really cheap double ramp spell. Indoor, one of the best early games, and a little flexible with it too, with like the explosive butcher lines as well as Spirits Unleashed. Mid game is really where you start to cap out. You can drop some indoors. You can, you know, continue to do that. But again, you have the TF Temple problem of like your late game is just your mid game, right? Turn 7 is where is like a turn after you dropped the indoor. But if War Mother's turned on, then you're not going anywhere. And then sort of just have the same thing for Nasus a little bit slower than Endure, I would say, though, because of the scaling on Thresh, or the scaling on Nasus being a little bit harder than the scaling on Endure. Like, it's really easy for your units to die. It's not as easy as excuse me, it's not as easy for you to constantly kill things. But again, like, actually, I'd say a mid-late game. Yeah, it's not terrible. Like, you're gonna beat a lot of the decks that are bad in the late game in the mid game. But again, like, you're still just an atrocity deck. And then Tristana, definitely the one that I have the least experience with. But I would say more similar to Endure. Doesn't really have the explosive power in the early game, but does actually have probably the best mid game of any of these, because like this is where Endure is just like dropping an Endure, and Nasus is like dropping a Thresh or dropping a Nasus. And Tristana is still pumping out like multiple units, like a Tristana plus some Gunners plus stuff like that. Swain Nora, this is another deck where like you have a very good defensive early game, and your mid game, again, it's more of the same. You're still just like kind of defensive. I would say it's like okay. This is where you're trying to like sneak in a broad main, and then your late game I would actually say is still quite good, because that's when you're getting down like Leviathan and really taking advantage of Swain and things of that nature. So like Swain Nora, again, if you're looking to like weather the storm, Victor Aphelios, Swain Nora, Bandle City Seraphine is kind of where I'd be looking. Maybe TF Temple instead of one of those decks if it's not really your cup of tea. Plunder, we have very solid early and mid game. The problem is that the explosive capabilities of Plunder is pretty limited. Like, your Spirits Unleashed is cool. It's not as cool as Endure's Spirits Unleashed. And again, don't look at this and like take this as gospel. I'm filling this in on the fly off the top of my head. I didn't pre-plan this, so listen to my words more than you listen to the colors. So again, Plunder not very explosive, and for a snowballing meta, something like Plunder that is difficult to snowball is like kind of whatever. Like a level 2 Sejuani, level 2 Gangplank, even with the Spirits Unleashed, is just like not the most broken thing that you can be doing at any stage of the game. And so I'm not huge on Plunder. Like if I was playing, I'd definitely be going more of like the Victor Aphelios, Swain Nora plus like Seraphine or Temple line. This is where I'd be at. I like War Mothers. I like the fact that it's got such a solid late game, but I don't know if it's the best Swiss option because again, horrible early game. We're just gonna fill all that in. Yeah, so Victor, like we said, pretty good at every stage of the game, and then pretty mid in the late game, almost arguably bad in the late game, where you kind of cap out at like 5 mana. So sure, you can turn that into a big Celestial, a big Elusive, something like that. But for the most part, your late game is just sort of trying to take advantage of like level 2 Aphelios, level 2 Victor, playing 0 mana weapons, and trying to finish off your opponent from there. But it also depends heavily on the kind of Victor Aphelios that you're running. And then all of these are like very aggressive decks. Azure Aurelia has like an unimaginably bad late game. They really need to kill you. Like turn 7, sure, maybe they can still make something happen. They really are looking to kill you in the mid game. And like Azure Aurelia is pretty cool because they got that buff with Desert, whatever, the Sand Soldier spell. And that's again where they get like this hyper explosive potential. So when we're looking at the meta as a whole, in terms of like what do we recommend here? Don't try to build an entire lineup around going for the late game, and be aware that certain things have such a bad late game that it kind of locks you into banning War Mothers. War Mothers is like the defining deck of the late game. I would say like Azure Aurelia is probably the defining deck of the mid game, where they just have so much explosive potential, but I don't know if this is really going to be like a super popular tournament deck, because again, it's very like combo-ish. It's very reliant on a couple of key cards, and while there are a lot of them, thinking of Sand Soldier spell, the Landmark, Azir, Aurelia, Field Musician can get you there a little bit. You do need to draw like multiple of those cards. Like one Aurelia is not going to hold it down for you. You need Aurelia plus the Landmark plus the Sand Soldier spell, something like that. But I've just never been a huge Azir Aurelia fan. But I do have like serious concerns about the deck's performance. And if everybody is just like going for the, hey, let's outlast the aggro decks and try to like limp our way through the late game, then yeah, you're going to struggle if you try to bring triple aggro. But I don't know if that's what everyone's going to be doing. That's what I would do, but I don't know if that's what's going to be popular. I think aggro is actually better positioned than it has been in a very long time, especially in Eternal, where you don't have to run specifically these flavors of aggro, or even Azir Aurelia, if that's what you want to call it. We'll call Azir Aurelia aggro in the sense that like it is ending the game on a similar clock to aggro. And that's kind of where I guess we would even put like Endure and some of these other atrocity decks. So really what you're kind of coming down to is like everyone's doing pretty well in the early game, except for War Mothers, which just fucking sucks. But not everyone's doing good in the early game in the same way. Some of these decks are really pressuring you in the early game, and then some of those decks are really good at surviving the pressure of the early game. And so I think what you're going to find at a high level is that passing is almost more important than it ever has been before. Trying to like play around those early removal tools, what is slow speed, what is fast speed, the avalanches especially. But that's kind of where I've landed on everything. Some things are like so situationally explosive that you are more prone to getting high rolled in this event than you ever have been before. I still will not sympathize with your post-tournament emo Twitter post. I don't give a shit. But yeah, when you come in feeling like you had a good meta read, you probably didn't. When you feel like you got high rolled, you probably did. And that's going to be the story for a lot of people. So, what do I recommend? A lot of people are looking at triple atrocity, I think, or at least double atrocity, because Nasus Tristana lineups have been doing very well in these events. And that makes sense, right? Both of these decks are getting on board really early. They have strong removal tools in the early game through like Soul Harvest and Hate Spike. And so like, yeah, maybe you don't have to go full Swain Nora and BC Seraphine to survive the early game. Maybe it's Victor Aphelios plus like these double atrocity decks, because these also give you a lot more game into War Mothers than something like Swain Nora does, because you can still slip through an atrocity when your opponent like goes to slam the War Mother's Call and you're like, okay, here's an atrocity, you don't have mana for a flash freeze anymore. But everything's very specific. It's very hard to be broad in this meta. It's very hard for me to come in here and give you a comprehensive overview and say, yeah, this is what you need to be doing, this is what you need to be looking out for, because everything is hyper specific, especially to the moment and the specific game that you are playing. So I think if you're just looking for the safest lineup, atrocity is a rather safe and powerful thing that you can be doing. And I am a little surprised at the fact that like Endure is not performing well in these smaller tournaments, because Endure reads to me as certainly the most explosive of the atrocity decks. And again, I feel like we're in a very explosive snowballing meta. So it is weird to me that like Endure's not getting there. And maybe it is just too easy to shut down the Endure explosiveness. Like even if I draw a god hand with Endure, I'm still losing most of my board to an avalanche or like a mystic shot plus a blocker. Like it's not too hard to stave off their early game, and then they don't have as many late game threats. Tristana has Bandle Gunners and Tristana. Nasus has Nasus and Thresh, and Bakai Reaper itself can kind of like snowball into these things. Whereas Endure like really just has Endure once we get outside of the early game. But again, it does have like such a powerful and explosive early game that like it almost feels more like it's in a league with a Zero Aurelia than it is with the other atrocity decks. And so that's just something to keep in mind. This isn't something I've thought too much about, but like if you're looking for a Zero Aurelia, but you're not trying to like play full aggro, maybe Endure is something that you style with that. Again, a big part is going to be just trying to make sure that you don't have overlapping weaknesses within your lineup, but it doesn't feel that important for you to have a comprehensive lineup of shared strength and weaknesses, because it's so difficult to find a lineup like that you are probably not running into your opponents having lineups with shared strengths and weaknesses. They're probably a little more haphazard and all over the place like yours is. So what I mean by that is you don't have to focus on like, oh man, every deck I play needs to have a strong early game and a good mid game and then like a bad late game, because your opponent is probably not just running a bunch of good late game decks. There are very few of those. And that's where I'm kind of calling into question, like, where's War Mother's going to fit into a lineup? And then, again, I think that like lineup composition probably doesn't matter too much, because again, I feel like I've got 13 decks here, and that's only half of the relevant decks that you're going to run into. So that's I know that probably is one of the worst explanations I've ever done of a format for Tournament Tactician. This might not be helpful to anyone, but it is the best that I could come up with, and really just try to like, you know, take in as many opinions about the format as you can and try to form your own and figure out where you're coming from. But it definitely feels like we don't really have any like good decks. Anything that I can obviously point to is like, yeah, because everything's very explosive. So yeah, if you want to know what I'd be running, Victor Aphelios, and then yeah, maybe I'd look over here, or maybe I'd go Seraphine and Swain Nora. but Victor Aphelios is definitely something that I feel passionate about. Is like, you should probably be running that deck. It just covers a lot of bases. It's a safe Swiss pick. When you get into Top Cut, you can get a little more specific, but, you know, based on like what you saw over the course of day one. But I definitely think this is like the Shen Fiora of season 1, where it's like, you should probably just run it in Swiss because it's very safe. Now, as far as what are the top 5 decks going to be by representation, that's a tall ask. I've never felt less confident in this in my life on any of the placements, but I will say Victor Aphelios it doesn't feel like a number 1 deck. It feels like a number 2 deck, but maybe it will just end up being number 1. For number 2, yeah, let's throw our Atrocity buddies up there. I'm definitely feeling aggro in the top 5, so I feel like Poppy Zig's got to get in there too. And then it definitely feels like one of these is going to be in the top 5, but it's, again, I still feel like there's going to be more aggro in there. Seraphine's never, like, really popular unless she's, like, broken. Even Plaza Guardian wasn't as popular as I feel like it should have been. TF Temple, I don't think is going to really break top 5. I'd say that comes in, like, number 7, number 8. I think that's going to be pretty low, actually. Let's actually move that down here. And then, I don't know, I'm not feeling great about Plunder. None of these other decks are really standing out to me as like, oh yeah, this is top 5. Like Azir Aurelia, I don't even think is going to be like crazy numbers. It might be like number 6 at best. But again, not really confident in anything here. So if I had to pick something, which I do, maybe it's War Mother. Maybe enough people just bring War Mothers. It's a very powerful deck. And that's kind of the thing, right? Is like, it's a snowballing meta. So if you don't draw your snowball hand, War Mothers will run you over. Like if you give War Mothers time, they will run you over. So maybe this is what it is. It really just kind of feels like the meta's revolving around like Atrocity, but not in a traditional sense. Like just have answers for Atrocity is probably the best way that I could put it. Like play aggro or have answers for Atrocity is, I guess, the best advice that I could give. But thank you so much for watching. I hope that was of any kind of helpful, and I will see you next week as we switch back to Standard and try to get into the LCQ. I will be co-streaming the top 64 for this on my Twitch channel, Caster Boulevard, on Sunday, so look out for that. You can follow me on Twitter at BoulevardTCG. Oh, that's right, it's BoulevardTCG on Twitch as well. Brain fart there. So yeah, follow me on Twitter. Look out for the tweet. I'll be going live and co-streaming that, and we can laugh at how wrong I was, because I will be very wrong. Thank you.